I want to welcome you to the kickoff event for the 5th Annual National News Literacy Week, a joint venture of the News Literacy Project and E.W. Scripps Company. I am Alan Miller, founder of the News Literacy Project and a former reporter with the Los Angeles Times and other newspapers. I want to begin by thanking Renee Arellano and her colleagues at the National Press Club for hosting us, our moderator, Tracie Potts, and our distinguished panelists, Sarabeth Berman, Margaret Sullivan, Stephen Waldman, and Kimi Yoshino for enlightening us, and all of you for joining us. The theme of this year's News Literacy Week is Spotlight on Local News, which is especially timely as we move into a year when there will be thousands of local, state, and national elections held. Local newspaper reporters who doggedly attend school board, planning commission, and city council meetings, and who scan police blotters and pore over budgets and contracts are essential cogs in our communities. They serve as the eyes and ears of the public and play a critical watchdog role for waste, fraud, and abuse, and holding officials accountable. They are essential cogs in our communities. I know this firsthand. I began what became a nearly 3-decade-long journalism career as a local reporter in upstate New York and later in Bergen County, New Jersey. Strong local news outlets help to strengthen civic life, encouraging people to become involved in their communities and serving as virtual town squares. Surveys show that Americans believe in local news outlets as more credible than other media sources. Yet these vital institutions are being lost in one community after another as financial losses force local newspapers to close their doors or thin their ranks. Amid the collapse of the advertising-driven business model for newspapers, since 2005, almost 2,900 newspapers in the U.S. have shut down, and more are closing weekly. Residents in more than half of U.S. counties now have little or no access to reliable local news sources. The growth of these news deserts is a grave threat to the health of our communities. The closure of a local newspaper results in lower voter turnout, decreased civic engagement, less effective governance, and increased polarization. Moreover, when the public has little or no access to credible news sources, falsehoods, hoaxes, and conspiracy theories can spread unchecked. Harmful content exploits our values, sows discord, and undermines trust in our institutions and the fabric of our public life. Even in communities where newspapers remain, fewer reporters are left on the beat. Since 2000, more than 2/3 of newspaper journalists have lost their jobs, a decline comparable to the coal industry, leaving many remaining outlets hollowed out as ghost newspapers. This is why the local news crisis is a crisis for democracy. Fortunately, there are reasons to be hopeful, which you will hear about this evening from our engaged panelists with their diverse perspectives. First, there's greater awareness of the erosion of local news and the stakes involved, in part because journalists themselves are sounding the alarm. New and innovative nonprofit outlets have sprung up across the country, including some that represent promising new business models, and some that focus on underrepresented communities that have historically been excluded and harmed by the coverage of legacy outlets. Philanthropists and foundations have stepped up, providing funding to launch and strengthen these outlets and models. Most recently, the MacArthur and Knight Foundations have launched a multi-year $500 million initiative called Press Forward that has attracted 24 foundation partners. Finally, the Rebuild Local News Coalition is spearheading a bipartisan legislative effort in Congress to provide a tax credit to help pay for advertising in local news outlets that could help revitalize local journalism while preserving its independence. Each of our panelists is making an important contribution on the front lines of sustaining local news. To get the discussion rolling, I want to introduce this evening's moderator, my good friend, Tracie Potts. Tracie is the executive director of the Eisenhower Institute at Gettysburg College. She was previously a senior White House correspondent for the NBC News Channel and an award-winning broadcast journalist for 3 decades. I am proud to say that Tracie, along with Sarabeth, are members of the News Literacy Project's National Journalism Advisory Council. Tracie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you all for being here, those who are online and those who are here with us in the room tonight. Alan is a good friend, and he brought me into this work of focusing on news literacy well over a decade ago, and I'm still very enthusiastic about making sure that not only young people, but our entire nation really has a focus on reliable sources of news, and that's part of what we're going to talk about tonight. Like Alan, I was a local reporter. I started out working in local news and broadcast from down south. I'm a Southerner, and I did that for 6 years before I moved to NBC News, and so my heart is very much in local news. I very much remember and cherish that connection with local communities. As Alan talked about the importance of being the watchdog for those who are elected and are our neighbors, right? And the people that we go to school with and work with and meet in the grocery stores, and the people who are making decisions that at the very most basic level affect us each and every day. And so tonight, I'm excited to moderate this conversation with my colleagues to talk about this. I'm going to introduce them, and then we'll hop right into what I hope will be some interesting questions, and later on bring you into this conversation as well. So to my immediate left is Sarabeth Berman. She is the CEO of the American Journalism Project, and she is part of the solution here, heading the first venture philanthropy dedicated to local news. They have given millions of dollars in grants and investments, $55 million since 2019. These grants to nonprofit local news organizations all over the country, and they have a growing portfolio of more than 44 nonprofit local news organizations. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Next to her is Margaret Sullivan. Margaret is a weekly columnist for The Guardian and also executive director for the Craig Newmark Center for Journalism Ethics and Security at Columbia Journalism School as of January 1st. Yes. Right, so brand new. She writes on media, politics, and culture. Like me, she has delved into the world of education, serving as a visiting professor at Duke University School of Public Policy, at the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy. You have written extensively on media, on journalism ethics, on press freedom, for the New York Times, for the Washington Post, and you're the author of a couple of books, one of which we're going to talk about tonight, Ghosting the News, Local Journalism and the Crisis of American Democracy. I'm very excited to get into that topic. Steve Waldman, sitting next to Margaret, is founder and president of Rebuild Local News and also co-founder and former president of Report for America, which is a national service program which is putting journalists in newsrooms. So part of the challenge that we will talk about is financial and supporting funding news, but then we've got to have journalists in there to tell those stories. Steve has covered national politics for Newsweek, for U.S. News, and World Reports for Washington Monthly, and interestingly wrote an FCC report about how people are getting their information in communities and the needs of communities. So hopefully we can delve into that. And finally, Kimi Yoshino, on the end, is editor-in-chief of the Baltimore Banner. So we're going to get a real look tonight at what this looks like inside a local newsroom. Kimi's job is overseeing operations, policy, content. She's a former managing editor at the LA Times, worked there for 21 years, and notably won a Pulitzer Gold Medal for public service for an investigation in corruption in local communities and local government. So thank you all for being here. And I'd really like to start with a very basic but a really important question. Why are you in this fight? What matters to you, and what is it that motivates you to support local news? I'll start with Sarabeth.
I'm motivated because it so clearly is a problem that really matters, and the data really backs that up. But actually, the reason why I'm motivated is because I think we are seeing a very clear path on how you get yourself out of this, and that I find very motivating. Like we are beginning to see a way to rebuild local news across the country, and just focusing on the perils in front of us can be really difficult, but when you have a sense of how you can map a way out of it, it's extremely fun to get to work on it.
That's great, and I was hoping you would say that, because so often we deal with these challenges and we don't see a path forward, but in this case, and several of you are working on that. Margaret, what's your why?
The why for me is really that I spent a long time at my hometown newspaper, the Buffalo News. I started out there as a summer intern, and I guess I hung around long enough that they made me the editor-in-chief. And I was the first woman to do that, so it was a very important moment for me. But in my time at the Buffalo News, which again was my hometown, I covered local government, I covered education, I covered business, and ultimately supervised those things. So I really came to understand how important basic reporting and enterprise reporting and investigative reporting is to a community, and what happens when it has faded. So I'll just use one number, which I think is notable and typical. When I became editor of the paper, there were 200 people in the newsroom, which was not a big regional newspaper in America. The Cleveland Plain Dealer was bigger, and the Baltimore Sun was much bigger. But it was, certainly a good-sized newsroom. And by the time I left being editor, 12 years later, we had reduced the ranks. It happened over the time of the recession in 2008 and 2009. We were down to around 145. And right now, basically 10, 11 years later, there are fewer than, well under 100, and probably hovering around 60 people in that newsroom. So down essentially from 200 over many years to something like 60. And you really can't do the same job. And it's hard. And at the same time, and I'll stop in a second, but there is a strong nonprofit newsroom in Buffalo, Investigative Post, and we're lucky to have that, and the TV journalists in Buffalo. But I still feel that the loss of the robust newsroom at the Buffalo News is a huge loss to the community. I know that it is because people talk to me about it all the time.
You made a really interesting point. There is no way that we can do that work and cover corruption and cover information that people need to know with 60 people the way we did with 200. And so it's the readers and the viewers and the listeners who eventually suffer as a result of that.
The management line used to be that less is more, but it actually is not.
Yeah. Steve, you're part of that solution that Sarabeth talked about. Why are you in this?
You know that old expression of when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail? And I think if I said to my wife, if my wife said, we're out of milk, I would say, it's because of the collapse of local news. So many problems that we don't think of as being connected to local news are actually either caused by or exacerbated by the contraction of local news that people don't think about. The fraying of communities, polarization, people demonizing each other, caricaturing each other, people not having the information that they need to solve their problems in their communities to the point that they become alienated from their communities, corruption, misinformation flowing more and more. All of these problems, which fundamentally come back to basically the collapse of, or challenges to democracy, of a functioning democracy, are either caused by or made significantly worse by the degradation of local news. So to me, it's just one of the most important problems facing America. And so I wanted to be a part of helping to solve that.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about your approach to solving that. Kimi, it seems redundant to ask you the question of why you're in the fight to save local news, because you're in the fight, literally, to save local news every day. But what resonates here with you, and what are you seeing working every day in a local community?
Yeah, I mean, everything everybody on the panel said, I agree with wholeheartedly. You mentioned the LA Times. I was part of a team that investigated this tiny little city of Bell, where the city manager was making $800,000. It was a huge, I mean, this is a tiny city in Southeast.
Wait, I used to live in LA, not too far from Bell, and I had no idea people were making that much money.
No,
That's
and
amazing.
it's a tiny town. The LA Times never really covered that city. There were 88 cities in LA County. And I saw firsthand what happens when journalists don't pay attention to cities. So that was sort of a very clear example to me of the power of journalism. But when I was at the LA Times, I wasn't really thinking about leaving. And I got called by the Baltimore Banner. And at about the same time, a reporter from the Atlantic wrote a story about Alden, about venture capitalists trying to take over the news business. And there was a very memorable illustration of a vulture sitting on top of a newsstand. And I read that story, and I was so outraged by the decimation of newspapers. It just timed so perfectly with my interview that I was like, I'm gonna go do this. This feels important. This feels like something that we have to do and that I have to do. And I am thankful every day for the last 2 years, even in the snow, that I have moved to Baltimore. And as I'm sure we'll talk about soon, it's been a crazy week in Baltimore. The Baltimore Sun was sold last week to a wealthy businessman who also owns Sinclair TV. And it's scary to think about what might happen to the Sun as a result of that ownership.
Well, you brought it up, so I'm going to skip ahead and ask you about that, because we often have seen in local markets where there were 2 or more newspapers or news outlets, one of them go away. I mean, when I was in Chicago, when I was in school, right, there was the 2 newspaper competitive advantage, so to speak. But sometimes in this climate, as you noted, having more than one outlet, but in a situation like this, maybe not so good. So what are your concerns about competition and about being able to get reliable information out to the people of Baltimore?
Well, I'll start by saying that the competition has been fun, and I think it's been good. And the reason why our founder, Stuart Bainum, committed to Baltimore is because he saw the writing on the wall. He saw what happens when Alden buys newspapers. They slowly dismantle it. They slowly suck the resources out of it, and the news organization goes from 200 to 100 to 50, and it's not good for democracy. So that was why we started in Baltimore. And what we saw for the first year was that they were very competitive with us. And slowly, as time passed, they stopped backfilling. And we were starting to see some signs that newspaper was weakening as we were growing. The competition in general, I think, has been really good. A great example is this past year, there was a massive report that came out on abuse in the Catholic Church, the Archdiocese of Baltimore. And between the 2 news organizations, the Baltimore Sun and the Baltimore Banner, we were able to identify and unmask the names of a dozen or so priests who had not been named. And I'm not sure we would have been able to do that on our own. It was the collective, I don't know how it happened, but it almost sort of perfectly split down the middle, that we were pursuing opposite stories. But I think, that was a really great example of competition. But without us there are there have been mayors who have been indicted recently in Baltimore for corruption.
You said something that reminded me of what Margaret was talking about earlier that happened in Buffalo, right? We saw it in Baltimore, which is you, and when you were in Los Angeles, you saw something happening and you had to go out and look at it and investigate it. But when resources are tight, journalists can't always do that. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about your book, Ghosting the News, and really how you've laid out what the threat is, and particularly connected to what Steve was saying, what is the threat when it comes to saving our democracy? Because we're talking about saving local news, which is part of saving our democracy.
Yeah, I mean, in order to have a democracy, you have to have an informed electorate. I mean, it's kind of basic. And one of the ways that people have been, have had kind of this very important common ground of reality is through local news. You don't, your neighbors and you may disagree on policy, or you may have a Republican, a Democrat, you may have a conservative, a liberal, whatever, but you basically know that there are certain things going on. You know the basics. And when that goes away, people retreat into their tribal corners. They get their news from social media, they go into their echo chambers, and local news is more trusted than national news. I mean, we have a huge problem in this country with trust in mainstream news organizations. But local news, I mean, it's just a sort of weird irony, because local news is more trusted, and yet local news is more threatened. So, when I wrote my book, my publisher, or actually the CEO of Columbia Global Reports, Nick Lemon, who is a former dean of the journalism school at Columbia and a really smart, wonderful guy, sent the book manuscript to Timothy Snyder, who is a Yale professor who wrote the book on democracy and is a real expert on how democracy works and authoritarianism and all of that. And he said that he liked the book, but that's not the point. He said that he thought that the decline of local news was the biggest threat to democracy that was happening. That was, it is the biggest threat. So it's a little bit like what Steve said, that even the not having milk in your refrigerator, it all comes back to the fact that we really need that common ground of reality, and it's so important to have it.
So let's talk about Steve and the process of saving local news. You wrote an interesting argument in The Atlantic about this, about the savings from corruption and how that's really offsetting investments in news reporting. Could you explain that a little bit?
Well, the premise was we're trying to convince either philanthropists or government to do this investments and donation and sacrifice their money or taxpayer money in order to help local news. And the point is actually it would pay back many times over. Like the investment in local news pays many, many dividends to taxpayers, to governments, and sometimes it's really direct. A story about, I think MLK.
A guy being paid $800,000.
Yes, well, that's a very good example, right? So that actually literally saved money for the people in Bell, California, much more than the salary of having a reporter in Bell, California, as an example. Or if you have, I think it was MLK 50 did a great package about hospitals basically screwing over hospital patients for indigent hospital patients to suing them for medical bills. and they blew the whistle on this, and people got hundreds of thousands of dollars of medical bills paid. There's, studies that show that, taking a little bit of a step back, that communities that don't have local news have worse bond ratings, meaning their municipal borrowing costs go up, which translates into higher taxes and more expense, so literally dollars and cents. And the way this became really very obvious to me, I talked about this in the Atlantic piece, was actually not because of some huge scandal that uncovered $60 billion of waste. Was at Report for America, there was a reporter named Zach Podmore who was at the Salt Lake Tribune, and he did this story that was a pretty mundane story, honestly, about how this poor county in Utah, lowest income county in the state, had been double billed by their law firm. So that was it. That was the whole story. At like $150,000 or something. And so they got $150,000 back. That was the story. What struck me, though, is that I knew that Zach Podmore made $35,000 a year. So with one story, he had made back for the county, 4 times his annual salary. And that happens, that's a tiny example, but that happens over and over again. And so, look, there are lots of reasons to strengthen local news. I think probably saving democracy is a good enough reason, even if it
But
didn't.
if that doesn't work for you, there's
If it
always the
doesn't,
fact
yeah.
that it makes sense financially.
Yeah, if that doesn't persuade you, then this at least should make you feel comfortable about investing either philanthropic or taxpayer dollars in saving it.
So Sarabeth, let's talk about investing, because this is what you do in a very big way. Talk to us a little bit about your approach and how it's working.
Sure. So our premise is that the problem we're talking about is the result of a market failure, that for a long time the market worked and we had thriving local news, and in fact it made a lot of money for a lot of people. And now the business model has completely crumbled and it's having all sorts of terrible implications that we've been hearing about. So our focus is on funding new business models that can sustain over the long term, based on the idea that we think local news needs to be regarded as a civic good. In the same way we think about museums and libraries and cultural institutions in our community, these important entities that help stitch our communities together that we don't expect the market is gonna provide for us. And yet we think it's really important, and we find a way as a society, as a community, as individuals, as government, to sustain them. And so we see ourselves as trying to usher in a new business model, a nonprofit business model, that is helping these organizations stand up and sustain over the long term as civic institutions. So what does that look like? We spend a lot of time out there trying to crack open this philanthropic sector. We have a huge amount of philanthropy in this country. We have philanthropy all over the country, at the local level, at the national level. And we spend a lot of time making the case that if you care about education, you need to be concerned about whether or not the school board in your community is covered. If you care about health outcomes, you need to be concerned about whether or not health in your community is being covered. So we spend a lot of time making that case and trying to bring in more philanthropy. We've raised about $170 million since 2019. And then we spend a lot of time then deploying that capital to be sustainable over the long term. So we now have 45 organizations in our portfolio that we fund across 33 states. We make significant investments, $1 million plus investments in organizations, and we're not funding the journalism, but funding the business and revenue operations of organizations so that they can turn that philanthropic capital into sustainable capital, meaning that may be sustainable philanthropic capital, continuing to raise money year after year after year. May mean reader revenue, individuals donating, becoming members, buying subscriptions. And then there is still advertising revenue out there. There are local businesses that do want to advertise in local media. It's just far diminished from where it was. Just last week, we announced several big investments, one of which is to an organization called Deep South Today. The CEO, Warwick Saban, is sitting here in the front row. They have 2 local news outlets right now in their network and are continuing to expand. One is Mississippi Today, the largest newsroom in Mississippi, which won a Pulitzer this spring, and Verite in New Orleans. So an example of this new generation of newsrooms that are not only developing promising business models, but having real impact on their community.
This is a really interesting point because all of us have or are working as journalists, and we just don't think about the money, right? This is not, but this is it takes a business model. We think about the writing, and we think about the, the $800,000 salaries in Bell and the other stories, but it takes a sustainable business model to turn this problem around and resolve it. And so you are going after those philanthropic dollars, but also providing resources. So let's talk about OpenAI, because there are a lot of newsrooms that are suing, right? But you have a different approach to OpenAI in terms of providing resources.
So this summer we announced a product and AI studio at the American Journalism Project, partially funded by OpenAI and also funded by a foundation called the Patrick McGovern Foundation, which is focused on using technology for good in society. And we started this studio with the recognition that we are about to, I think, yet again, really transform how we all interact with information. And yet we know that the front edge of information, the act of going out and reporting new facts and information in a community, the computers are not going to be able to do. We need reporters. But these are tools that could be very useful to newsrooms. They could help you, for instance, a small newsroom, go through hundreds and hundreds of pages of FOIA documents in a way that, the New York Times would put 20 reporters on, and here you have a small newsroom, you can now do it. So there is potential in these technologies, and we felt like, okay, this revolution is coming. Let's go ahead and learn how to use these technologies. So we have a small team that is really trying to become experts on this. We're then making grants out to our portfolio to help them experiment. We just announced 13 grants to our portfolio, and we'll keep going. Trying different things. Some of it's gonna work, some of it's not gonna work. We're gonna learn, we're gonna publish it, we're gonna tell everyone, don't do this, this is not a good way to use the AI, or do this is a really smart way to use AI. So that is how we're thinking about it.
Kimi, I'm really interested in what you think and how that may or may not work realistically in your newsroom. So before I ask you that, though, for those of us watching online, we would love to hear your questions, and we're going to open up to the audience here as well. But if you are online and any of this has sparked questions, it certainly has for me, please email them to media@newslit.org, and we will get to those questions in just a few minutes. So media@newslit.org. OpenAI helping to sift through FOIAs and sift through all kinds of information. How might that work in your newsroom?
I totally agree that there is a positive use for AI and a destructive one, and we have to figure out the positive ones. We partner with Big Local News out of Stanford. They have been working on ways to cull through city council agendas to try to find trends. We've got an automated hookup with our Slack that puts out warn notices. So if any business is going to be laying off a certain number of people in Maryland, we have an automated Slack notification that's a lot faster than us going and pulling all those records all the time. So there are definitely ways to use some of the technology that is out there. We just have to harness it and build it in a way that it's a positive tool.
Innovation is really important here. As newsrooms and news organizations are struggling, and as they are challenged, and as we have people who are looking at new models and new business models to support them, it is relevant and important to look at how innovation and how technology can play a role. So I want to turn back a little bit. We were talking about ownership earlier with you. So private equity firms, I'd really like to open this and ask any of you, are buying up local newspapers. Do you see that as a, how do you see that? As a
Yeah.
It's wonderful, okay. So, you know, what should we be looking at here in terms of the future? You just mentioned layoffs, you know, could that happen?
I mean, you know, I wrote about the situation with the Baltimore Sun and to some extent about the fact that the banner is there, and we should be very glad about that, in a Guardian column this past week. And one of the points I noted was that, you know, in this environment, you will hear people say, if only we had local ownership. But Sinclair, in essence, is local ownership, but we're not happy about that because, you know, there's local owners and local owners. So, but I think in general, having, you know, nationally based private equity firms, AKA hedge funds, running newspapers is an awful thing. And the reason that they buy them is to sort of go after a lot of these papers are still profitable, you know. So to sort of go after the sort of end stage profits that are still there. And how do they maximize those profits? They cut reporter salaries. I mean, it's a way to temporarily enhance the bottom line, but it is not a way to sustain the journalism.
Half of the daily newspaper circulation in America right now is owned by a hedge fund or a private equity firm. And we are not going to be able to get our hands around this problem without confronting head-on the ownership problem, that so much of news is owned by private equity or hedge funds. And as Mark said, there's studies that have shown this, that statistically, newspapers that are bought by hedge funds cut newsrooms more. And they're doing it because they can milk more profit. Basically, if you cut your costs, it takes a while for the revenue to drop at the same as much, so you can make money in the interim.
It takes a truly altruistic owner to make this work. And I will say that in my experience so far at the Banner, we are very lucky. Stuart Bainum, it seems like his heart is in the right place. He has given us a $50 million runway. That's a lot. That's more than basically any other local news initiative. But most importantly, he lets me do my job. He does not call me up. He does not complain about stories. He does not tell me what stories to do. We have not had a single, there's been no interference. And that's important, and it remains to be seen whether David Smith will bring the same sort of stewardship and ownership to the Baltimore Sun. But I think the stewards of the world are rare, and we're seeing that. We've seen that play out.
You know, just to be clear, for those who aren't following the Baltimore Sun saga, what we're talking about, like in one sense, it sounds great. Like you're a two-news organization town. That's really unusual. The issue is whether or not the new owner is ideologically driven, whether or not he's going to turn it into a conservative organ. There's some evidence that he tried to do that with Sinclair. And that's really the problem. And it's actually part of a bigger issue that we're also seeing. One of the things that have happened as these vacuums have appeared of local news vacuums is that sites that are called pink slime sites have emerged. There are more than 1,000 of these. And these are basically websites that look like real websites. They have names like The Record and The Statesman and things like that make it look old-timey and real. But they're basically funded by political collectivists in many cases. And they already have a business model. They don't actually care if it's profitable. Their business model is to influence people. If they lose money on that, they've looked, it's like a campaign contribution in effect. They're spending political money in order to help manipulate people. And I am really worried that we could end up with essentially having on the local scale what we have on cable TV on the national scale, of basically ideologically feuding entities. Or go back to the 1820s, where we basically had local news, or news was basically part of the political parties. And I just, that is one of the many things that gives us a sense of urgency, is the only real way to stop that from taking over is to flood the zone with real local news and sustainable business models. That's the only way we're going to be able to block that scenario from developing.
And then at the same time, this is why news literacy is so important, right? Because as that's happening, we also really need to educate people to identify and recognize the Statesman that's not a real newspaper, and other outlets. So we've talked about ownership. We've talked about what's happening inside newsrooms. We've talked about innovative ways of using technology to support. Let's talk about the government. So I wanted to ask you, particularly Steve, so what, if any, role does the government have in helping to sustain local news? I know you've worked on legislative priorities, and some people are going to go, like government? Do they really have a role here?
Well, preamble, that I think the most important thing is what Sarabeth and Kimi are doing, the innovation on the ground, and include also in the for-profit sector, where there's also innovation happening. That has to happen. But the reality is we're not going to get there without government help. Honestly, I came to that conclusion pretty reluctantly. I think it's a weird coalition we have, actually, because no one really wants to be there. It's like a coalition of people who would rather not be advocating for this. But we've all come to conclude that it is necessary.
Is that sort of the equivalent of if there were feuding people on opposite sides who all didn't like your story, it was probably a good, pretty good story?
Yeah, and it's first of all, look at the numbers. Okay, so the drop in newspaper advertising revenue over 2 decades is 82%. So $40 billion went away. Now, with all this great new philanthropic money, we've added back 100 million a year, 200 million, maybe we'll get up to 300 million or something like that. 40 billion down, 300 million up. Now, it's not apples to apples, because that was paying for some stuff we don't have to pay for anymore. But it's reflected in the statistics that Al said, of like 2/3 of the reporters aren't there anymore in 2 decades. It's an incredibly fast collapse. And my current favorite horror story is there are now 36 local newspapers without a single local reporter, which is a very weird concept. I'm trying to think of an analogy, like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches without peanut butter or something. But it's that bad. So the scale is beyond the capacity, at least right now, of just the business model improvements and just the philanthropy. Second is, as weird as it sounds to have the government involved, the government's been involved all along. Like, the government has been involved in the media sector literally since the founding of the country. One of the first big social programs that the founders did, literally the second one that they did, was a massive program to subsidize newspapers in the form of cheap postage. They basically, everyone else had to pay a lot, newspapers didn't. It would be the equivalent of $40 or $50 billion in today's dollars. So it would be bigger than the NASA budget as a scale. And other countries do it. We've done it in the past. So as a philosophical matter, we've been here before. The government has helped media before. So then the question is like, yeah, but can it be done in a way that doesn't screw it up, that doesn't make it worse? And here is where I have a lot of sympathy about the scrunched nose that you had when you were asking that question, because No, it's totally legitimate. Like, in fact, everyone who's involved in advocating for government involvement in local news should be terrified about doing it badly. Because we've seen around the world examples of governments that have used, their involvement
So that's what I was going to, so what does
but
doing it well look like?
there are ways of doing this that are safe and effective. Wait, safe and effective, that doesn't sound like the right context. But, I go back to the history on this. I really took a lot of, lessons from the Founding Fathers on this. When they did the postal subsidy, which was a big deal for like 100 years, they didn't have content measures. They didn't say we're going to give a postal subsidy to the highest quality ones, and we didn't say we're going to give it to the Federalist papers, but not to the Republican papers. They just said, like, you get it based on if you mail a certain distance. That's who it was, right? So it was content neutral. Any government involvement needs to be content neutral.
So policies that support the distribution of news and support the business, but do not get involved.
Do not have someone, I don't want someone sitting
what
around
the
at a
news
government agency deciding they're really good, they're not so good, let's give them a grant.
Right.
And I definitely don't want like news organizations to then have to go lobby them saying, please, could you give us some more money like you did last year? That would be bad. But as I'll just give you some examples of really creative ideas that have come up in the last few years that I think give us confidence that this really can be done. So one is the one that Alan mentioned. This is a creative idea someone came up with. A tax credit for advertisers, small businesses that advertise in local news. So the subsidy is actually going to a restaurant. The restaurant decides which news organization they want to work with. Or an employment tax credit. This is actually probably our favorite one, the one that would have the biggest impact. It's basically a refundable tax credit for news organizations that hire and retain local reporters. So they're not sitting around deciding which local reporters and say, oh no, this year education's a more important beat. It's just, if you have a local reporter, you get a subsidy. And it goes to what Sarabeth was saying. If you look at this as a public good and a market failure, that's when government's supposed to come in. And libraries is actually, you mentioned libraries. It's like, the number of reporters per population over 2 decades declined 62%. The number of librarians per population during that same time declined 0%. The reason is taxpayers support it.
Subsidized.
When we have market failures, our society has a few strategies to address it. Philanthropy is one of them. Another is government funding. And the fact is, journalism in its purest form would have no money attached to it whatsoever. There is no money that is great to have to feel that journalism is truly independent, as the situation with the Baltimore Sun, I think, is signaling. But what we do have as a way of insulating ourselves from that is diversifying the funding as much as possible. So I don't think any of us think that local news should be entirely funded by government, nor do I think ideally it would be entirely funded by philanthropy. Right. We don't know. What we want is to be able to insulate journalism as much as possible from any particular revenue stream, but we know that we as a society need to figure out the revenue that's going to fund the journalism.
Yeah, we want to put the buffer around Kimi in her newsroom, but still allow the business model to flourish. So in the next few minutes, and we're going to open it up to those in the room as well as those online, I'd like to ask each of you, what do you see down the road? We started out talking about the fact that we have a crisis here. We have a problem. We've talked about several potential solutions. 5 years from now, Kimi, what do you see possibly, hopefully, as positive trends, or maybe not?
I will say I don't think we are done with the negative trend, unfortunately. So I will say my former news organization, the LA Times, is looking at a triple-digit layoff, likely this week. Sports Illustrated last week laid off almost their entire staff. I don't think we're done with the declines. So that's the downside. It does make the work that everybody on this stage is doing more critical and more urgent. And I will say, I'm hopeful. I am extremely hopeful about the Baltimore Banner's future. We have a diversified revenue model that is a mix of philanthropy, of subscriptions, of events and advertising. I'm hopeful about many of the projects that are underway with AJP. There's a lot of great work being done across the country. The question is, can we replicate it? Can we do it at the scale that I think is going to be necessary in some of our communities?
Is there anything that you've heard in this conversation that excites you? Anything in particular that makes you hopeful? Whether it's private investment, whether it's tax credits, are there any particular ideas that as a local journalist you say, boy, I wish that would happen in my community?
I mean, all of those things excite me, but what excites me is that more and more smart and dedicated people are putting their time and their effort into it. And I think on the philanthropy side, there has been a change in how people are thinking about journalism. The public good that you know, I can fund education reporters and be just as effective funding journalism and impacting, you know, and resulting in change as I can like buying 1,000 textbooks. You know, these are lessons that I think philanthropists are beginning to learn across the country, and that's important. That is a big shift in mindset.
That's a really important point, and I'm going to call an audible. I'm just really curious of those who are here in the audience, and we will relay this for those online. How many of you prior to this conversation came into this conversation thinking about journalism as a public good?
It's a self-selected.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a large majority, not everyone, but a large majority, and I think you make a really interesting point that's a mind shift. That needs to be the foundation of any of these types of efforts. Margaret,
well,
5 years down the road, what's working?
A couple of things. Well, what's working? I mean, I think it's important to note that the good things that are, I mean, I'm sorry, you know, I have to say some of the stuff that troubles me as well. The good stuff that's happening is largely happening in relatively big communities or cities or regions. And the places that are suffering a lot are small towns that have lost their weekly newspaper. And you know, I'll just note that 2 newspapers a week are going out of business in America. And very often, the weeklies who, you know, they're not doing Pulitzer Prize winning work, but they're a part of the fabric of their communities. That's a huge loss when those things go away. So, you know, I think that's something that we need to think about and keep in mind, that, you know, just having those weeklies is part of what keeps us sort of together as a self-governing democracy that, in which people share a common ground of reality. So that's, you know, that's on my mind. You know, the things that give me hope are the things that are being talked about here, and that's great. I do feel like we need to have some serious governmental support now in the form of tax credits, because I think it has to be sort of a multi-part solution. And it has to be membership, and it has to be philanthropy, and it has to be subscriptions, and it has to be advertising, and it has to have some government support too. There's no way to do it without all of these things. And I just want to say one other thing while I have the floor, which is that if I could fix anything in this country, I think I would fix news literacy. And I'm so happy that the News Literacy Project is doing what it's doing, and that others are working on it, because people need to understand, you know, they need to be able to pick up a piece of content and know whether it's pink slime or whether it's, you know, whether it's Mississippi Today. And that's a huge thing, and we need to educate and get that not just into classrooms, but into older folks and throughout the fabric of society.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, absolutely. And I think that the News Literacy Project is evolving because we have begun to understand. When I first started working with the project in 2009, we were working primarily in schools. Like, I'm really excited to see students here tonight. But we evolved because we began to understand that that education doesn't only need to happen in a classroom, it needs to happen throughout society. 5 years, we're gonna have those tax credits widespread in many communities, or what do you see happening?
Well, first on the bad side, actually it's now 2.5 newspapers a week closing. So to your point, it's accelerating. The problem's actually accelerating.
It'll be over soon.
When they run out.
Yeah.
So I do think that there's, one of the good things that's happened that's really different than 5 years ago. 5 years ago, if we were having this conversation, you'd also have the sort of contours of the collapse happening, but there weren't that many models you could point to that looked like a solution. Like, we knew we had to do something, but there really weren't that many. And now there's a few hundred. And that makes all the difference in the world, because we're now at the point of like, okay, what we need to do is scale those. And we'll be fine. Not only fine, actually, better. Like, we have the ability to make a better local news system than we've ever had before that's actually more representative of the communities they cover and use better technologies and tools to do it. So that's, the optimistic part of this. I think the two things that I kind of think have to happen to get us there, in addition to general continued innovation and lots of smart people doing it. One is what Kimi was talking about with local donors. We use the word philanthropy, and we imagine Andrew Carnegie or big foundations. And that is an important part of what's happening right now, but ultimately what's going to happen is small donors on local scale. So it's not just $1 million donations, it's the $10 donations over and over again. Basically, community journalism isn't going to survive unless at a very dramatic scale. And then, yes, I think some sort of government support. There are subsidy-type approaches, and then there's other things that the government also can do to help. For example, my colleague Anna Brugman, who's here from Rebuild Local, is working on a project that is basically taking the $100 billion that is circulating in the economy right now for broadband and basically making the case that we have in this country a few hundred we call double deserts, places that have neither broadband nor local news. And if we get them broadband but don't give them accurate news, we're giving them high-speed internet access to crap. So we need to try to solve both problems at once. So that's a public policy thing that doesn't involve like a new bill or new law, but it's just saying, hey, let's start thinking differently. Let's think about public banking regulation and antitrust law and things like that, and just ask the question, is there a way of changing this? Is there a way of tweaking this that can actually help communities have stronger journalism?
I think you bring up a really interesting point about local donors. Not long ago, I got an email from my local news outlet that was a solicitation, and because I really relied on them for education coverage, but because I had the connection and I knew the reporter and I knew the value of her work, I immediately responded to make a contribution. And I wonder, you talk about the $10 over and over and over and over. You started out with hope, so you get the last word, and hopefully you will land this plane with some hope. But what are your thoughts about 5 years down the road, particularly in light of the work that you're doing with philanthropy?
We think of this as a generational project. It took 20 years, so a generation, for the local news industry to unravel. And we are, yes, it's still unraveling, but I think we have declared this a market failure. It really is, at a systemic level, no longer working. And we're now years into the rebuilding of local news. I if there was a silver bullet here, none of us would have spent the evening in this room. This is a challenging issue to tackle, but there are really clear strategies, and the strategies are underway, and there's a lot of energy around accelerating them. So I find sort of looking at this as a generational challenge and thinking of us as sort of marching way 5 years closer towards the rebuilding of local news across the country.
So thank you for that. So we are ready for your questions. Well, never mind, there are quite a few. And this is a great thing. So I saw your hand first. We've got microphones coming to you.
Would you like... Hello. Would you like the sort of positive speech that's been floating around in my head, or would you like the question that may or may not lead anywhere?
Whichever you prefer. The question.
Okay.
Interrogative.
So what I was thinking about while you were talking is, how do we curb the problem with funds? One of the biggest issues we've had with our work is that it is hard to find funding. It is hard to find consistent hours of work, things like that. I can't speak to that the best. You can ask Kristen, she knows more. But what I was wondering is, what options are there for moving from an ownership model to more of a co-op model where the community owns the newspaper?
Interesting point. All right. Co-op model where there's community ownership. I mean, this really builds on the point that you made about community members investing. But what about community ownership? Any thoughts?
I mean, I will say that, even though we have funding, it is not a blank check. So I am always thinking about 5 years down the road, what happens then. And what I have found so far is that the only way that we're going to make this work is exactly what people on this panel have said, which is to make people care enough about the banner, to make people care enough about the journalism, to make people see the impact, that they are actually personally invested in it. And I think that's the only way that community journalism and local journalism gets out of this. They are invested in us, they are invested in our coverage and our stories.
And for that to happen, the reporters need to be invested in the community in a way that they haven't necessarily been before. One of the things when I was running Report for America that we would say in the opening session was that local reporting is a public service profession. And that is why they joined, because they believed that. And that's a sea change too. And it's important for us spiritually and emotionally, but it's also important for the business models, because if people in the community are not convinced that the reporters have their backs and they're doing it in order to help make a better community, then they're not going to reciprocate and support the news organizations.
I mean, one quick thing I'll say is, and it's kind of strange to say this, is that I think that I have probably met more people in Baltimore than I did in 20 years at the LA Times.
Wow.
Yeah, just
We
being
use
out.
the vocabulary movement building, that this is about building a movement. And the one other thing I'll add is there's definitely a case making, going out and really making the case. But there's also a science to fundraising, and a lot of industries are very good at fundraising, and the journalism industry hasn't really come to it. And that's one of our big focuses, which is just the kind of discipline and professionalism around how do you build a pipeline of funders, how do you cultivate them effectively, how do you make the ask, make the pitch, make it on a regular cadence, what emails pitches work, what email pitches don't work. And I spent a long time working for an organization called Teach for All, which is the global arm of Teach for America. Teach for America raises $250 million a year. That's just one organization. The whole local nonprofit news industry is $175 million. So it is possible to build an industry that can bring in a lot of philanthropy, but it takes
You've got to bring in the
discipline.
expertise from outside the newsroom. You had some thoughts, Margaret?
Well, I just think, to address your question directly, I don't know that we're going to have too many news organizations that are truly co-ops. I haven't seen that much, if at all, and I don't know about it. Sort of like your co-op that sells the groceries or something. But I think we can have a kind of metaphorical version of that, which is membership, where you feel you are a part of the finances of it, and you feel a strong connection to it, and it's much more than just a subscription. So I think that's the way that people can be deeply involved.
So showing people the value of their local news and then giving them a lane, an opportunity to
be a
become
part of it.
connected and be part of it.
Yeah.
Question in the back.
So I've got a question from online viewer Madeline, who asks, national news often depends on reporting from local newspapers. How can these large outlets support local journalism?
I mean, I could take that on. I mean, some very large news organizations, including the New York Times and ProPublica, have overtly and directly gone out and said, we're going to support, we're going to work with local journalists, and we're going to do local journalism with them. Dean Baquet, who left the New York Times as executive editor, didn't leave the journalism world. He is working on local investigative journalism for the Times, you know, to build that up. And ProPublica has done a great job with that too. But, you know, I think in general, it's not at the top of the list for the largest news organizations.
I'm happy to report that the New York Times does an annual employee campaign where they raise money for their employees and the company matches those dollars, and AJP is one of their grantees every year, so that's good.
That's great. I was going to say, as I was walking out the door of NBC News, and we've talked a lot about local print journalism, but as I was walking out the door, one of the projects I was involved in was NBCU Academy, which is a broadcast version of that, which is investing in local news organizations and trying to build that pipeline up to the national news.
And we also have a reporter from the Banner that's part of the New York Times investigative network, but I think they could still do more.
Honestly.
Question from the floor.
Hi. My name is Ricardo Sandoval Palos. I'm the public editor for PBS. And I wanted just to raise a quick point and then a quick question for y'all, is that one of the solutions is actually what happens now in public media. You know, the complaint I hear every day is that I'm not going to give you any more money because you're a taxpayer funded organization. Well, PBS is a full income from the federal government is 14% of the total, right? Where it matters, however, are the small stations scattered around the country, which actually mirror news deserts, where that federal contribution from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting is huge for the local budget. And what we've seen at that level is actually something interesting, is CPB encouraging collaborative newsrooms, like in Alaska, in Georgia, in the South, in different parts in the Intermountain region of Idaho and Montana and Colorado. So that is something that I think is encouraging to see that as a solution. We've also seen public media stations buy up local newspapers, Chicago Sun-Times and the Denton paper in Texas. It's concerning, however, because it relies on a local know-how or a local journalism education, not so much on the literary side, but on the quality of the journalism. And I'm wondering if some of the efforts that you are seeing and putting money behind or offering solutions for go toward or are aimed at building up the professionalism, the ethical standards by which a lot of local journalists have to operate. I'm just curious about that.
Thank you for that. You make a really interesting point. I was sitting with one of those collaboratives a couple of years ago in California, and that very point was made, which is building up the professionalism of the local news organization as part of making the case to the public about why they should value it.
Well, that is the whole thrust of Report for America. In addition to placing these reporters in local newsrooms and giving a paying half the salary, they're swarmed with training and mentorship and Pulitzer Prize winning mentors for each, one of them practically, and there's about 70 or 80 different training sessions each year that they can get, and they're thirsty for it. They want those skills. And then just to go back to the first thing, because we hadn't really talked about it, it's interesting that we had a whole panel on the future of local news and hadn't talked about public radio or public TV yet, exactly. Right? Mm-hmm. That's sort of telling. And it's a really important question, is what is public radio and public TV going to do? Are they going to be major, important, helpful players or not? And there really are quite a number of very innovative public radio stations doing fantastic local news, a smaller number of public TV stations, and there's all sorts of reasons why that might be, that you probably know about better than I, but I guess I would just say that that's a big question. Like, that could go either way. Like, I could totally see public media saying, like, we'll stick to educational programming, this is too controversial, too hard, or saying, no, this is exactly what we're here for. Let's dive in and try to really help with local news.
Steve, you bring up a really interesting point. Just a few weeks ago, Alan and I did a workshop with a collaboration of Pennsylvania nonprofit journalism newsrooms, including public TV and public radio. And where they're doing it, they're doing that work very well. But I think you bring up a really good point. Like, how do we scale that?
In our portfolio, we have 2 public radio stations that we've invested in that have been very innovative in terms of becoming digital news organizations that are really investing in their local news organizations. So there are some examples. Yeah. Louisville Public Media is one
Great
of them.
point, thank you. We have a group of local journalists here, and over in the mix, I see a question. Did you have a? That's okay.
Okay. I'm actually with the PBS NewsHour. We did not coordinate this. And a program called Student Reporting Labs, where we're working with schools all over the country to train journalists. So sometimes the students will come up to me and they'll say, I was going to go to med school, but now I have discovered journalism and storytelling, and I'm going to change course. Or I was totally into STEM fields. My parents were so excited I'm in STEM, but I've done this program and now I'm going to go into journalism school. And I catch my breath. And I think that the salaries in journalism are a real barrier to diversity and to the kind of coverage of the communities that we all want. So what do I tell those students, and how can we build a better career path so that you can actually make a living doing this work?
Yeah. I mean, I think that one of the keys to it, and we see it happening, is that newsrooms are unionizing more than ever before. And that's, I'm somebody, because I've been in management for a long time, but I also was a reporter and was a member of the union. That is hugely important. And I would say that this is anecdotal, but I think it matters. I know a lot of young journalists because I've taught and because I just know them. And a lot of them are thriving. They're doing okay. They're finding their way, and they're making a living, and they're paying the rent. I think it is really troubling. I don't know that there's going to be some kind of systemic answer to that. But I would never discourage a passionate young person from becoming a journalist, because they need to really want it, but I think they can make it.
This is like an incredibly creative time in local news. So you have the ability as someone going into the field right now, not just to do a good job as a local reporter, but to actually help invent the future of local news, which was definitely not true when we were getting into it. So it's really, but the salary issue is a really serious one. Like Report for America, I knew we had a problem when we had it in the application and it said, what's the salary you're planning to pay? And a couple of them filled it out in hourly rate terms, like $12.25. We had to do the math, and $22,000 a year, $23,000 a year. And it's particularly a problem in the communities Margaret was talking about before, of getting people to go to another community and paying them very
Next
little.
to nothing.
It's
It's
rare that
really
nonprofit is higher paid than commercial news,
It's
but,
really
but in
true.
our industry, that is the case.
That is
the
true.
nonprofit news organizations are often
We saw
25,
that too.
50% higher because it's new capital and new organizations recognizing that you can't possibly live on this. Your question just also sparked another thought, which is that we're seeing a lot of these news organizations take different approaches to how to cover their communities. One program that we're really excited about and we're seeing across our portfolio is a program called the Documenters Program, where they're recruiting community members and going through a pretty rigorous training on how to show up at public meetings, how to document it, take notes, and then feed that back to the newsroom. So in Cleveland, where we've launched a new newsroom, they now have trained 800 Clevelanders to document meetings, and they pay an hourly rate for it.
That's great. Thank you for that. Yes. I think we have to wait for a microphone.
Thank you. A part of the decline in local news coverage has been the tremendous decline in the amount of regional reporting coming from right here in Washington, D.C. There used to be regional reporters from all over, and now there are very few. So I'm wondering, nobody mentioned this, how can we increase and improve the coverage from Washington to cover the local congressional delegation or how some national policy is specifically affecting a given community?
That's an interesting point, but I identify with you because I started out doing exactly that, but boy, is it expensive, and how many local newsrooms can afford to embed that person?
I mean, it has to be done collaboratively. And I think a great example of it is Spotlight PA, which is, because exactly what you're talking about on the national level or the Washington level is also true in state capitals, where there's been such a decline in state reporting. And the best solution I've seen has been when newsrooms get together and work together to do that kind of reporting with each other. And it's hard because our DNA says compete and does not say collaborate, but I think that's a way out.
And Spotlight PA is that example that I was talking
Yeah.
about earlier. Perfect example.
It's a good idea for a new nonprofit.
Absolutely. We
Regional.
have just maybe time for one or two more questions. Thank you. If we can get a microphone here, thanks.
Hi, thank you. I'm super excited to be here. My name is Jackie Scott, and I am a professor at the Community College of Baltimore County. And one of the things that I've been trying to do is, I think there's been a lot of work among educators to fight like fake news, but one of the things that I've been trying to do at my school is promote a knowledge of local news and how local news is part of a news ecosystem that's integral to becoming a citizen and being civic-minded. And so, but sometimes it feels like you're kind of yelling into the wind, And so I'm wondering if you have any suggestions for community college professors or how we can kind of raise awareness and in our own, with our students, with our faculty.
You could assign my book.
I've been to your talk, your Zoom talk, and I've given a talk to a local women's organization. I actually quoted you in that quote. So,
Well, first of all, kudos to you and thank you for bringing that into the classroom. So how do we at that level, Kimi, maybe Baltimore?
I will say, I think this is actually the existential crisis that local news is facing, right? People subscribe to the New York Times, they subscribe to the Washington Post, they watch CNN, they watch Fox, and they think they're informed. And they are about something. They are not informed about
their communities.
Yeah. They're not informed about their mayor's race, their city council race, and it's a huge, huge challenge. Kudos to you for recognizing this and trying to get your students to engage. And I think the way that we're trying to solve for this in Baltimore is by really thinking about what are the issues that affect people's everyday lives, right? So maybe that's recycling, which in Baltimore is only picked up every other week, not every week. Maybe it's crime, maybe it's education, you know, going to those local issues that are at the heart of our day-to-day lives. But I will also tell you, we are covering the Ravens. we are covering where to go eat. And it is those everyday things, those everyday useful things that we hope are eventually going to draw people in to the meat and potatoes too. I was sort of embarrassed to say that, not embarrassed actually, it's good. Taylor Swift is coming to Baltimore next week because the Kansas City Chiefs are
How in the world are you
Baltimore
here?
Ravens. And honestly, it's probably one of the top read stories on our site today. And you know, you've got to do some of that too to get people talking and thinking about local news.
Well, I think there's no better way to end this forum tonight than really Taylor Swift, but also really you made an excellent case for why people should value local news. And I think, as we all talked about earlier, that is at the heart of beginning to solve all of these problems. Thank you, Sarabeth, Margaret, Stephen, Kimi, for a great conversation. And also, thank you to our audience tonight, both online and here in the room. We appreciate you joining us this evening. Thank you.